Cool. Right, we're all live, back in. So thanks.
Good morning.
For joining me. Yeah, good morning. I'm glad we finally managed to put this together.
Well, I think it's the amount that you travel must or may even exceed what I travel. So it's good to finally catch up again, James.
Yeah, tell me about it. Although it nearly got derailed again. You'll notice I'm actually working from home today. So it was just before Christmas, our washing machine completely packed up. And when you've got two teenage boys who are sport mad, you can imagine that's not a good thing for the house. And they said, oh, by the way, yes, we're going to deliver on Tuesday. And they go, anytime between 9 o'clock and 5 o'clock. I was like, oh, great. Nothing more specific than that. They said, no. I said, okay, good. We'll give you half an hour notice. Like, oh.
We should enable them to join us too and see what they say about everything you want to talk about. So it would be an interesting addition to today.
Well, yeah, I'm sure they'd give us some fabulous insights. But I did, just to tell you, I did. I'm just intrigued actually by this. Before the call, because I didn't have to travel into the office, which by the way isn't far. I mean, it's about 5 fields that way, which is rather nice. I went for a run, and I was thinking, I was mulling over our sort of direction and course of questioning, and I remembered, obviously you do a lot of trial running, right, if I'm not mistaken, or a lot of just tell me about that quickly, because I'm fascinated by that, and I don't think a lot of people will probably know you for that side of things.
Yeah, so I've been known to do some longer trail running. I lived in Asia for a long time, and so based out of Hong Kong, and Hong Kong's got this great trail running community, and so a lot of people think of Hong Kong just as this dense packed city and kind of like a Blade Runner type of an environment. But the reality is it's got some of the best trail running accessible within like 5 minutes of the city than most other cities don't have.
Is that in the sort of the hills behind all the things? It's just a massive...
Yeah, so it's both on Hong Kong Island, which is kind of what many people think of Hong Kong, and so you've got some great hills there, and then you've got great country parks out towards the Shenzhen or the China border, and then lots of other islands. So Hong Kong has about 300 islands in its territory, and so that's how I got to running trails. And so it kind of started on like 25 and 50 kilometer type of trails. There's this annual event that does 100. And then I got into these longer events, which were 250 kilometers, which was part of a Racing the Planet series. And we did that. One race was in Nepal, and one race was in the Gobi Desert in the far western part of China. And it kind of is amazing because it shows you what you can do. And it's just step by step. And these longer distance races where you have to carry everything on your own back too. So all of your supplies for the week. The organizer sets up tents, but you need to make sure you've got enough water between checkpoints, and it's off-road. And so it's just an amazing experience. And so it's kind of deep to my heart in terms of every now and then getting on a longer journey.
What do they say? It's an itch that needs to be scratched. When I was in my early 20s, there's a run here in the UK which runs along the South Downs, which is a sort of a geographical formation across the very southern area of the UK, and it's a 100-mile run along the South Downs. It's called the Gurkha Challenge. It's actually called Trail Finder, but they call it the Gurkha Challenge because it's a team event. You go in teams of 4, and your time is recorded when the 4th person crosses the line, or the 3rd person. I can't remember which one it is.
Yeah.
But it's called the Gurkha Challenge because every year that it's been run, the Gurkhas have won it. No one's ever beaten the Gurkhas. And I was doing that. So I'm now coming up 45, and I was 22 when I was training for it. And I was, 8 months into training. And obviously when you're 22, sort of, you can just do anything. But it was the intensity of the running up and down the hill. And I got injured in my right knee about a month before I was going to do it. And I was devastated, and I never got to do it.
Hey, there's 2024 coming up, right? And so that's and so the Gurkha Trail, which Oxfam now does on a global basis, and it's 100 kilometers, teams of 4, and you've got to pass each checkpoint, each of the 10 checkpoints as a team of 4. So it's really a team event.
Similar thing.
And so you've got all of the complexity of like getting 4 mates who want to do this. You run through the night. And in Hong Kong, as an example, the fastest time is like 9 and 10 hours for 100 kilometers across a huge amount of ascents and descents. And the Gurkhas, which there was a large contingent, of course, during British, within Hong Kong. And now it's just these super fast runners from around the world who go there to try to beat the time. And it's extraordinary what people can do again, and trying to avoid the injuries that are a result. So we'll see on the trails, James, in 2024. We can start with the Trail Walker, which I believe is in the south of the UK in the September timeframe, and we'll add you to the team.
Yeah, it's the finding 4 mates bit, which is probably the challenge. Although I will just say, just finishing off on this, I'm building a few sustainability roundtables into next year, just actually to bring really cool people together to talk about issues around COP28 and all the various conferences which are going on next year, and it'll be done. But I was recommended to speak to one person. I think his name's Paul Patterson. And he's another one of these, another one of you lot, the sort of mad endurance people. There must be a sort of a really core community of people that you have to be a certain type to be able to do it.
I don't know, maybe it's like Fight Club. You never really talk about it or promote it. So
exactly, except on your LinkedIn profiles. Although you don't.
I don't have it on my LinkedIn profile. There may be a vid on if you Google me, in the past. But,
oh, well, anyway, so we better probably go on to the things that I'm interested to talk about. And again, just for transparency of anyone watching this in the recording, I mean, the whole purpose of this is for the book research that myself and Dr. Amy Redmond are doing, and I suppose the authenticity that I have in terms of putting together things like this is wanting to have a transparent perspective on it all. And there'll be insights that I know Neal will share, which may not make the book, but there'll be things that I know that we'll talk about which may well inspire or at least educate people that want to go on the journey that perhaps Neal's been on. And so we stream all of this, and it's there saved as a bank of content for anybody. But Neal, could you just give just a sort of a quick précis in terms of where you are with Yardi and that sort of career to date, because I think that will set the scene as to why I wanted to have a chat with you. And then there's some sort of areas for me that I want to talk about around that sort of Yardi experience, because obviously it's quite unique in the sense of being a prop tech, if we want to call it that, but it's very established, and I want to explore that journey. But then I want to sort of delve into your global experiences on a personal level as much as anything. So yeah, start with an overview from your side.
So maybe an introduction as to who Yardi is. And so Yardi is a US-based firm. It was founded 40 years ago, believe it or not, by Anant Yardi. So Yardi is actually the family name of the founder. And headquarters are in Santa Barbara, California, so a little town about 100 miles north of Los Angeles. And back in 1984, Anant developed a property management system, which he called the Basic Property Management System. So less marketing, more dev, and that's how he started out. And so the initial platform was focused on residential or multifamily, as one calls it in North America. And over the last 40 years, we've continued as a company to grow and innovate and focus on really prop tech, which would be the current term. And as a global organization now, we're still privately owned and managed, no outside investors, no shareholders. And we have over 9,000 employees globally, and our annual revenues are just under $2 billion a year. And so we exclusively still focus on real estate as a sector. And the overall strategy is to identify really the different processes and the workflows that are associated with real estate and how that changes in different parts of the world, and be able to reduce the friction as part of those processes, further leverage off of digitization and technologies to improve performance. And performance, one could speak of in many different terms, whether it's kind of that core asset performance in terms of the profitability, could be termed in terms of customer service capabilities. So in terms of how to make sure that you provide a great experience through digitization of application processes and resident and commercial tenant engagement. As well as then just to manage the asset more effectively from an ESG or sustainability side. So lots of different definitions. And so we would probably be the largest global company right now focused on real estate technology and with a global presence. So in my role is I started, almost 14 years ago now, initially based out of Hong Kong, where I've been for a number of years before joining Yardi. And I help manage our international operations, so everything outside of North America. and moved to Europe about 7.5 years ago, based out of Amsterdam, which is one of our locations in Europe.
What a city it is as well. What a city it is. So, I mean, that's quite a broad experience. And I mean, in all of that time, has Yardi evolved much? Because one of the things I'm quite fascinated by, in particular with Yardi and a few of the other larger, what I would now call an incumbent tech startup, is how does a technology startup keep ahead of the competition? How does it develop and evolve? So I'm sure you've seen that over your sort of 14 years with Yardi. Could you just give me an overview of that evolution of, I don't suppose you can necessarily call it a product because it's not a product. It's such a multi-layered organization. So just wax lyrical for me about how does a prop tech company evolve over time with such an establishment behind it?
Yeah, well, I think maybe the first thing to kind of highlight would be is that companies can grow through many different ways, right? And so one would be through organic growth of continuing to develop products, expanding geographically, expanding the types of services that one provides to customers, but primarily on an organic basis. And I think that the second way that companies grow is through acquisition. And so acquisition could be a complement to the existing product base, or clients or companies grow, not just in the real estate sector, but others, and they grow aggressively through acquisitions. We've largely focused on the former, so growing more organically, and we've done 20 or 30 acquisitions over a period of time, but they've been very selective in either adjacent spaces, which we're new to, and or primarily doing acquisitions for people and IP, and then redeveloping the technology back into a core Yardi stack. And that's a very different approach than how maybe some other companies have grown and focus on growing. And it's acquisitions for revenue and customers rather than the technology. And so the difference too primarily would be is that the more technologies, the more companies you purchase, the harder it is to assimilate those technologies and determine which is the platform that's going to grow and scale and be aligned to the ongoing investment. And so I think that's one of the things that's differentiated us, and Anant Yardi, our CEO and president, really having that vision to say, listen, I'm going to continue to, as technologies evolved, and clearly we were, an on-premise platform with diskettes, if anyone remembers those. We were very early into the cloud, and so we've been providing ASP, or cloud as you call it now, solutions since the year 2000. And certainly the cloud has changed in terms of both definition as well as the infrastructure and the criticality of the infrastructure and how security fits into that. But we've always believed that to kind of continue to build and aggregate on a unified basis, and that includes architecture and databases and alignment to technology stacks, rather than just connecting disparate systems over a period of time, hoping that that would be the best approach. So I think that's a core differentiation between how we've grown on a organic basis largely, and keeping focused on in terms of who our customers are in the regions that we want to be able to operate in.
And just again, just elaborate a little bit on that for me, because I'm curious in terms of whether there are phases of growth that a business like yours goes through. So does it go through a phase of growth of sort of, well, the easiest form of growth is geographical growth, because that's where our customers are, and our core product will expand first geographically, and then we go through more of an M&A type growth because we've got the geographical base, and then we need to grow customers, so we'll buy sort of symbiotic type businesses. Does it go in that sort of form, or is it a little bit more muddled and nuanced?
I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends on what the strategy is, and sometimes it's just half a chance, right? So it's by accident, and I would say partially our growth trajectory was on a global basis was, let's say, by chance, and some people may dispute that. But if we look at the organization
why would it be disputed, Neal? What?
Yeah, so if you turn back the clock and we say back in, the story goes back in the mid to late 90s, is we were always a very focused North American company. And there was satisfaction with that because the US real estate and the Canadian real estate market is so large, right? You really don't have to be a global company to be meaningful and profitable and focus on technology based on the size and the complexity and really the public ownership, i.e. REITs and public funds that own real estate in the US. And so what drove us internationally was existing clients that said, hey, listen, we love what you do locally. How do we, but we have this problem in Europe. And so in each of these cases, it was really our existing clients in North America that said, we want you to do the same thing over in Europe for us, or here's this other challenge. And so another example would be is that traditionally the company for the first 16 years was very focused on kind of core property management. So asset management, property management. Yeah. And there's the entire hierarchy above that, which is kind of the ownership structure through SPVs and foreign entities and tax efficient entities, i.e. the consolidations, and as well as then managing in terms of how the capital flows up to the respective funds or the investors. So we would call that in our investment management suite. And in that particular case too, this large group that we were working with from a property and asset management point of view said, we have this problem, we're wondering whether you could help out. And so we developed a platform through those conversations, knowing that they would help us too in terms of developing, validating as that early adopter. And then we continue to monetize that area and continue to invest in it. And that's become a large portion of our business. And I'd say also a differentiation for us versus other vendors on the market.
I'm actually just interested in that as a strategic element of growth.
Yeah.
Because I put it to you that was probably possible 25 odd years ago when there were very few sorts of holistic solutions out there. Do you still feel that from a much younger proper startup business, which is maybe 3 to 5 years old, they've had a bit of funding, do you still feel that's possible as a element and lever of growth, which is you still get customers saying, I want to take you elsewhere? Because I'm seeing that.
Absolutely. I think absolutely. I mean, I think there's this, so some of the trends in real estate one could see is that the first step would be is that increasingly investors invest globally.
Yeah.
And so whether that's pension funds and insurance funds or the likes of private equity groups like Blackstone, BlackRock, et cetera, is their focus is international first and foremost, right? Or they've expanded. There's just a tremendous amount of capital that has to get put to work internationally would be the first thing. The second thing would be is the increase or the expansion of the number of sectors that they invest in. And so that would be from, let's say, core office portfolios into industrial portfolios into international multifamily, i.e. build to rent, or international student, i.e. PBSA portfolios. And so often the tendency is, I don't want to work with different vendors in different locations because that increases their complexity and their cost of ownership. And so can you help me do this in another market? Because I want to be able to work with you and I want to be able to expand that relationship. I think that happens all the time.
I suppose the line of questioning was going down. There's often a criticism that is put to technology startups slightly later in the curve than a Yardi, which is Yardi is very much a broad system across the sort of the life cycle, whereas some of the startups today they often said you're solving problems that simply don't exist, or it's such a small nuanced problem. And I suppose my line of questioning was the problem is very geographically nuanced, or it's such a small problem which solves the problem, but it's a small problem that can't really then translate to being a globally an easy to sort of expand globally problem, if that makes any sense. I'm not really making it a lot, but I suppose I'm saying you guys are very broad, therefore it's easy to take you elsewhere. Whereas when you're solving such a small issue, it's not as easy. That I suppose was my lining.
I think it's a combination, though. I mean, we've only become global because of again, ultimately some decisions and some good partnerships, and then hiring of people and some other things, as well as the investment and kind of the long-term vision of that. And I would say one of the most common things that kind of I see as we look at both acquisitions and just mentor other startups as an example would be is that many startups today are kind of a copycat or a follower type of a strategy. So they see something that someone else is developing. And dare I say it is that the current dev environment in terms of leveraging off of cloud computing, leveraging off of distribution stores being building it on an Apple device or on an Android, iOS in terms of distribution from the store's point of view, and programmatically as well. It's so much easier to be able to create a product and to distribute it, i.e. sell it, and make it accessible to a broad variety of customers. But the problem still is that what value does it create, and is it sticky enough?
Yeah.
And I think that's the problem, right? And so everyone wants to create new technologies because they think that they can do it maybe better or faster or cheaper, but the longevity and the ability to actually generate revenue on it in a smaller geographical region, I think that's fine for a period of time, because then you learn, you get clients, you have that robust type of process by which you get feedback from clients, you further develop the maturity of the organization before you take it to a new market. I think a lot of organizations too, from an international point of view, move to the US too quickly, as an example, right? And so rather than continuing to kind of build up that core base of clients and revenue, either in the UK or in a particular market in Europe, and do that very well before they try to conquer the world. I think that would be kind of the second mistake that companies make.
Yeah, and I see that a lot, I'm afraid. That is a very, very common thing. So two other sort of questions, I suppose, on the side, the technology side, I think, before. And one of them, I'm going to reference the product market fit link that you sent through yesterday, because I've seen that before, and I think it is very interesting, because again, it puts, I suppose, those what I would call incumbent startups who've been around for a while in a very, very different position to where we are today in terms of, I suppose, the chance that you will make it. So I'm going to focus on that. But before I do, I just want to focus on something that you said earlier on, and it's taking you back to that acquisition side. And actually, there's probably two areas on here. The first one is you mentioned that an acquisition, and you then absorb that technology into the tech stack of Yardi. Now, the reason I want to focus on this is because I think it's a very unique challenge that you have, but I also think it's probably going to become a more prevalent challenge that traditional real estate companies have when they have they may or may not have a tech stack which is either good or not good, and they're going to have to start having a much more open source type play to it to be able to develop whatever they need to for the sort of the future. So just talk me through that process. And forgive me, Neal, you may not be the best person in terms of that side, but at least give me a sort of an oversight as to how Yardi approaches that, and how you see the sort of the challenge of absorbing a sort of a company into your existing infrastructure and framework. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah. So maybe I'll lead with say is that the majority of the acquisitions that we've done in the past are small and medium-sized acquisitions. And so they're perhaps easier to consume. And we look at in terms of who the leadership is of the company in terms of more on the product dev side, the engineering side. And I'll give you an example of acquisitions that we made specifically in the co-working space. Yeah. So in terms of flexible office space. And so these were about 6 years ago. And one was a platform in the US called Yardi Systems. And they were kind of the operating platform. So kind of core reservations, membership, how to manage the shared service centers per se, or the co-working centers. And they had a revenue engine, but they didn't have a general ledger. So kind of very disparate. They'd always have to plug into other solutions as well. And it was based on a certain type of code base and a certain type of database and a certain type of cloud. And then the other acquisition that we did was a Sterling-based company up in Scotland called PBL. And they were the infrastructure side that would manage kind of the quality of service for Wi-Fi data and voice in co-working facilities. So with both of these firms, what we did is that on the Yardi Systems side is that we redeveloped the code, or we rewrote the software onto the Yardi stack. And so the Yardi stack, sometimes referred to as Voyager, which is kind of our core database and kind of the core general ledger, as well as where
Just going to stick around. May well have lost Neal here for a second. He's come back. There we go. Just going to bring you back in, Neal.
Come back, yeah.
There you go. There.
Awesome.
There you go. I've just lost you. Just froze at that point.
There you go. I think it's probably the faraway connection that we have between where you are and where I am in Amsterdam. Anyway, so we took that company and we rewrote the software back into the Yardi stack. And as part of that, we also then further enhanced it. And the reason why we did that is knowing that in the flexible workspace environment, that increasingly clients are looking for platforms that enable organizations to flex how that building is actually operated, from traditional long-term corporate occupier letting to short-term letting. And so whether that would be a third-party manager like a WeWork or an IWG or a TOG or someone to that extent who leases space from the landlord, or the landlord themselves just wanting to create either a new brand, which has also happened within the space, and or just in terms of being able to provide additional flexibility to their existing corporate occupiers. And so as we've continued to develop our products, that's kind of one of the core, I guess, strategies, as well as what's worked out really well for us, is leveraging off of that single source of truth. And so then you have all of your customer information, you have all of your financial information, and that makes it a very robust system as it pertains to large data formats and data warehouses, then as we leverage off of AI and machine learning for additional services and benefits to the clients.
I just want to take you back a little bit. You talk about leveraging off the single source of truth. I'm assuming by that you mean the core program that obviously Yardi is built around, and you then talk about you essentially take that company and you rewrite the code to then fit. I mean, you almost said it flippantly. I can imagine that's not an easy thing to do. It requires a unique team in order to do it, and time. So, I mean, how does that all work?
Well, I think it takes some strategy and some effort. Clearly, I would also say that it takes consideration in terms of, clearly, when one buys a company, you have an existing client base that you have to continue to support.
Yeah, and if you're
so you have to take into consideration the current obligations that one has with those customers too. And in terms of what would a roadmap be or a migration be to the core platform, right? Because you don't want to lose those customers either. And at the same time, you need to think about kind of the longevity of what the future requirements are and the overall vision in terms of how that fits into a larger tech stack focused on real estate, in which the definition of real estate, and those, whether you're the investor, the owner, the occupier, the fee manager, et cetera, in terms of how that all is changing over a period of time. And I would say it's not easy. And so the guys in our engineering department do really well in terms of how we do these things, but it takes time and effort. And patience.
And timing wise, those two projects you talked about, roughly how long did it take to do the full integration into the Yardi core single source, as you called it?
I'd say between 12 and 18 months.
Okay, so that's interesting. So that's what I kind of want to go down in a small segue here, because I was on in fact, when I was in Hong Kong, I went to I suppose it was almost an internal company meeting with JLL, and they were launching two of their new internal products, which was fascinating because I always thought that JLL, it had to run through JLL Tech and Spark and all this sort of stuff. But actually, they're almost a separate entity, Hong Kong. They were acquired by JLL. They've got their own cost centers and incredibly forward-thinking sponsor, I suppose you would call Sylvia. But she was talking about the process, and the reason they got away with it was because it was before JLL Tech really got off the ground. But that was 2018. They started on that project. I was there at the sort of, it had gone through its MVP, it had gone through its testing. So that was about, I think if we're really honest about it, probably a 3-year process from ideation and the hackathon they had internally to then picking the solution and building it out. And I mean, it was brilliant. And it's actually a really worthwhile interview because from a corporate innovation person, I thought she was fantastic. But it still was a 3-year plus process. You're talking about an integration of an existing platform in with an established incumbent tech startup as being a 12 to 18 month process. And it comes back to that often cited build, buy, invest thesis that you should have in terms of both incremental and radical innovations in terms of improving what you're doing within a company. So have you got any thoughts on that? Because obviously none of these are quick wins. And I've always been one for, potentially invest or buy as a much sort of I suppose, quicker win because of what you're talking about, which is essentially you're buying the customer base and the revenue, and you're growing through acquisition. But it's still not easy, and you still need to have an established element to it to make it a success. Otherwise, it could be absolutely an awful experience.
Yeah.
Where do you sit in terms of your experience from the buying element? Is there a, what have you learned from that? And do you think from a real estate perspective, it's the best way, or should they look at building their own like JLL did, or having the sort of the investment side where it's not going to muck around at all with it all, but they might get the benefits of it? Where do you see that?
Well, I think it dramatically depends on what side of the fence you sit, and whether you're a stakeholder
as in tech or as in prop.
Yeah. So if I kind of maybe divide it into platforms, so tech platforms themselves, is I would say that the strategy often depends on the whether a company is venture backed, public, private, and what the goals are. And so those things may be self-evident, right? Obviously. But the example would be, is I think we're unique, whereas almost every other company, if you look at kind of the predominant large other platform companies that exist, whether they're European based or whether they're US kind of global based, is their strategies all have primarily been is to buy revenue. Yeah. And so what that leads is this question mark in terms of, which product is the focus from a development point of view, because product XYZ exists in 2 markets, but nowhere else. And at some point in time, you need to develop and focus on the ongoing development and the resources and the innovation in terms of how to tie this all together. And often those decisions, if they're disparate, are good for the company, bad for the employees, bad for the customers, one could presume, because it's not equal focus anymore. And so if you're in one market and there's vendors who maybe have 4 or 5 different platforms for one market, they're all the same, right? More or less, i.e. they're all like, they do similar functionality, but they're 4 different development streams. That raises the question of, where's the company going to focus on? And so I think that's kind of this curious statement in terms of, can you develop a global platform that operates across multiple different jurisdictions, multiple different sectors? And it's tough, but it's rewarding over a longer period of time. I think if I were a real estate operating company, an owner, and I guess JLL is a combination depending on where you are in their capital stack too, is what we've seen over the past 6 years perhaps is this desire somewhat to replicate what happened 20 plus years ago in the .com era, by which I had to get on board from an investment point of view because there's been these outcomes that have been positive, and I want to be partake in that technology spree. Right. And so if you look at the number of companies that have set up incubators or investments into prop techs, where in the majority of the cases, the outcome hasn't been positive from a financial reward point of view. So it's really hard to distill why it was done, other than someone said, we need to do it too because someone else is doing it now. I think that's really interesting. Right.
Well,
and then if you look at kind of the third bucket, which says, should I build it or buy it? And what's my team good at? Am I a software company, or am I primarily a company that's focused on managing and operating real estate on behalf of my clients? And technology is super important to be able to do that. But do I buy or build and invest? Because if you build yourself, it's a long-term strategy, right? It's not just a short-term strategy to say, I'm going to do this for a period of time. And then it's about corporate alignment. And so I think all of those kind of fit into the play in terms of what should I do? The answer is kind of this MBA answer, is it depends on the circumstances, but there's certainly some lessons learned in that for each of those different cases. It hasn't been all great for all of the scenarios in terms of performance as it relates to the decision.
It's a beautifully worded MBA answer, as you say.
There you go.
But it's a fascinating aspect, and I share your wonder at the investment side. The more I dig into all of this, the more fascinated I become in that, because I had another interview with an ex-British Land director of strategy and innovation the other day, and that was really.
I was with Sally, right?
Sally.
That was really interesting. Her view in terms of what she's doing now. Yeah.
Well, it was on many levels actually, because I had a lot of people. I'm going slightly off tangent, and I'll come back to the point. But I had a lot of people saying it was really fascinating because on the one hand, they were saying that we were very creative and innovative and forward thinking. And on the other hand, it was, but we want to guarantee success. So we invested in very late stage venture, and we only really worked with very, very late stage tech startups because we wanted to guarantee success. And I had a lot of people back channeling to me, not wanting it to be public and saying, but that doesn't make any sense because then they're not really creative and innovative. And I said, and I actually counted it. And it's what I'm finding interesting when I'm looking at, digital transformation and innovation and leadership in particular is that there's no right or wrong answer to this. And we've got to almost get ourselves out of this sort of thought process that innovation means taking risks. And risks can be calculated. And so what British Land were doing were, when they looked at their strategic perspectives wasn't about true digital transformation in terms of we want to change the culture of British Land.
Yeah.
Their strategy was we want to add value. And we want to add guaranteed value. Now, I could be critical of that. And I probably would have been 6 months ago, 9 months ago, in the sense of saying, well, but you're not being innovative. But actually, what Chris, who was the CEO at the time, was doing was he was showing innovative leadership because he was still driving value, which is ultimately the objective of the CEO.
Yeah.
So,
and Simon Carter continues to do that over there as an example with that kind of view and vision. And you could maybe say that their portfolio is unique. And so the decision that they have in terms of investment, what they do to digitize, is not more simplistic, but it's certainly more ring-fenced in terms of what their strategies are. But they've been challenged too, right? And so not to make this conversation about British Land, but this is all public information. But, with Meta pulling out of their deal, right? So Meta signed a 20-year lease, didn't move in, had an exit termination payment of whatever it was, 187 million pounds. That was probably a shock because all of a sudden you do have this larger property that says, oh my goodness, I had one tenant for 20 years, cash flows were all kind of guaranteed, right? Very predictable. Real estate likes predictability in terms of cash and occupancy. And to have that large of a customer kind of bow out, even though there's a financial penalty, those things are disruptive. And the pandemic would have been super disruptive too, in terms of how you manage kind of the movement from office to work from home, to work from office, and the incentives that you have to give or the alignment that you have to give to make employees come back to the work.
Yeah.
But that's an entirely separate topic, which is super interesting too, because I think it's a core impact for CRE as an overall opportunity and challenge in the same time.
But that is the exact point about taking that British Land point on in terms of your reference there to the investment strategy and putting money into venture firms, because for me, it's a contradiction in terms. So you have an established industry that likes predictability. We've just established that. And yet they're putting money into firms. Maybe, let's take Fifth Wall out of this from British Land's perspective, because it is a later stage fund. But, let's take your Pi Labs, let's take your Metaprops, let's take your PropTech Ones, anybody, Taronga in Australia. All this at a much earlier stage, and they are expecting failure. They're expecting 70% to fail. And so I'm struggling to understand in my head the thesis of why they've invested in early stage when they like the predictability and not the risk. And yet, by the very virtue of investing into VC funds, they've got actually probably more risk than anything else. I can't make sense.
James, I think one thing to remember is that no one's disclosing what their investments are. And so are these material investments, or are these rounding errors from an investment point of view? And so you could say that any investment needs to be stringent, et cetera, right?
Just clarify that for me. What do you mean? Because I would have assumed
so
there's always a large capital investment if you're going into these places.
Have you asked the question?
No, it's an assumption.
So I think that would be an area to look into in terms of what's the commitment and the investment, and has it changed over time? And so the question would be, so the owner occupiers, or the owners, the landlords, your British Lands and others, is what's their investment been into these funds in terms of the materiality of it? And so one is just participation alone, gives you access to the club, so to say. And so, and what Jonathan is doing with Turunga, et cetera, down in Australia, it's great, right? Because again, their funds are also very much focused on, let's say, ESG and sustainability, et cetera, and everyone's interested in that. But is it a material investment on the larger scale of things that would kind of move the balance sheet for a large publicly listed REIT, et cetera? So I think that would be a question, versus just being able to have the conversation, be part of the club, and get access to performance, or in terms of visibility, in terms of what's happening in the industry.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. That's entirely fair, because there is I suppose there's a very naive perspective. And I think, again, this is where my development over the last 9 to 12 months has come from, which is previously, I would have been very, very critical of British Land for being so safe in terms of their thesis in involvement. And, 12 months ago, I would have said, well, the only benefit of investing in a VC fund is the capital return, on a 10x fund, and so on and so forth. And actually, what I've learned over time is that's probably one of the very few, there's one of many different advantages of investing in funds, and capital return is probably not massively high, because they're probably, as you say, it's access to the club, it's access to the consultancies, it's access to the advice, it's access to procurement, all of those different things that come with funds, which are probably there. But let me just take sort of, I suppose, go more onto a slightly different area of focus. And there are very, very, very few executives that I get the opportunity to speak to, which have that global view of the market. And you're one of them. And there really genuinely is not very many of us at all who have that much more holistic global view. What's your perspective on the sort of the different geographies which are out there on a top level view as to their sort of transformation journey, more from a traditional side rather than a tech side? Where do you feel that each of the geographies are placed at the moment?
Well, I think so on one side, you can define the difference in the geographies is by asset class. So in terms of where the focus is, i.e. by sector. And an example would be multifamily or build to rent, right? And so if we look at the UK, build to rent is a relatively new asset class, i.e. 5 to 6 years old. The number of the stock that's available and operating on the market, it's like 80 to 90,000 units, and it's growing. So it's a big investment from an asset class point of view, but it kind of pales in comparison to the operating units for PBSA, which is student, which is closer to 600,000-700,000 beds in the UK alone. But to continue the story in terms of sector, if you look at Asia, excluding Japan, is that the multifamily market is non-existent. And that would be for a few reasons, and Singapore might be a good example. That if you're Singaporean, home ownership is super high because the government encourages it, also through your CPF, which is your pension fund, right? You can take loans against, and they have the housing board, which encourages ownership. So the market for kind of this build to rent, institutionally held build to rent or multifamily market is very low. And the same would go in Hong Kong and in some other markets. So sector, in terms of the focus on which sectors are prevalent in each of the different markets, would be one thing that's very different internationally.
I'd also add to there, for example, later living is another classic example.
Yeah.
Again, UK, Europe is probably quite prevalent, whereas, for example, I remember I was in a conference in Indonesia, and one of the other keynote speakers was the first ever retirement, because they were calling it retirement home development in India, because they don't have it. And they don't have it
because it's the family unit is so different in terms of just historically, and this idea that your parents live with you for a longer period of time, regardless of the size of your flat or your home, right? And that's changing a little bit, right? So as generations kind of evolve, that definitely is changing, but it's not a big enough, fast enough change to kind of change the size of the asset class for a period of time.
It's fascinating dynamics, though. That for me,
Yeah.
it's so accepted in the geographical silos that people operate that they can't see outside of that, in terms of that simple thing as, there are developments in China where they are built as a 2-bedroom flat with a literal granny annex on it.
That's right. Yeah.
And that is how they are built. And I find that sort
Yeah.
of thing really fascinating, in terms of you as an executive leader having to understand the differences and the nuances between all these different markets and plan for that. And so you said that there's asset nuances. What else are you seeing geographically?
I would say that there's transparency nuances in terms of sharing of data. And I would say, if you look at, Australia would be top quartile, right? US would be top quartile, UK largely. Australia had some of the first, publicly listed real estate investment trusts, as an example. So kind of very transparent in terms of how they operate. And if you compare that to other large Asian jurisdictions, or we'll touch on the Middle East in a moment, is that the ownership model has been very different. It's generally, so many of these jurisdictions have been influenced or controlled by, let's say, 5 or 10 families or conglomerates. And the same holds true in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Hong Kong, in the Philippines, and in Singapore, right? And some are more public government kind of centric. But there's these smaller groups of kind of individuals who control real estate. And so the ability to want to share publicly in terms of results has traditionally been much more opaque than in other markets. And so if we look at in terms of what UNREV, as an example, and what other organizations and associations in Asia have been trying to do to share information to a similar extent to what organizations share in other parts, I think that's also a difference. I think the other thing is size of market. So size of market, population drives real estate from an investment point of view. And the markets are just dramatically different sizes. And so you may say, China with 1 billion plus people is a large market, but it's hugely complex. And we can kind of see that with the crash of a lot of the large developers who, for all intents and purposes, are kind of bankrupt and in default. But the Chinese government right now is trying to figure out in terms of how to have a soft landing rather than a hard landing, right? It's already more or less had a hard landing, but for many of the investors and the outside bondholders, et cetera. And so the size of the market also depends in terms of how you then create product that solves a problem in one market, and you take into consideration transparency, availability of technology, as well as language and culture in terms of how that spreads. And so those are some things and considerations too, and they can be very nuanced. And if we look at Japan as an example, is that Japan often is seen as this large country of innovation from a technology point of view, and it has been for a while, but it's also very kind of closed off in terms of the technologies that traditionally it's used, right? In terms of, if you look at mobile phones, et cetera, for a long time, kind of GSM and other technologies weren't in Japan. It was locally developed technologies around Docomo and other things. And this has changed over the last 20 years. But the use of technology in Japan from a real estate point of view, I would say is still much farther behind than other more mature markets in Asia Pacific, including Australia.
Yeah, it's one of the few markets I haven't been to. But I do recognize what you're talking about from what I know of the people within it. They were much later to the challenge. But so I suppose changing it a little bit, because I'm just conscious of time, and the problem is we've sort of waxed lyrical about a lot of everything here, because there's a lot of interest I think we both share. But I'm quite interested in the leadership journey that you're seeing. And so when we're talking about all of the leadership challenges that real estate leaders have, you obviously again see that on a very global basis. Are you finding much resistance compared to, say, 14 years ago with Yardi, or are you finding that leadership is getting much more in tune with the challenges they've got? And where do you see that progressing over the next, say, 5 to 10 years? Because I think that's the only time frame we should really be looking at here.
Yeah, anything beyond that might be a little bit too far-sighted.
Well, no, and
James,
we joke, but that's I think you're absolutely right. I think they
Yeah.
can't look that far ahead. But yeah, so where do you stand?
Are you referring to, or is the question more in terms of kind of the market itself and kind of the controllers, so to say, of the real estate assets and the investors in terms of what they're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, exactly that. Exactly. Because I'm just to put my put out there, and I want to be challenged on this because I'm struggling with it. I feel that the real estate industry struggles with a slight leadership challenge of short-termism, and it's a global problem. We are looking after our short-term interests, and we're not looking at long-term issues that the industry and wider society faces. So I'm just interested in whether I can be challenged on that.
So, I mean, I would say is that there's no doubt in my mind that the executives and the leadership of kind of capital-intensive real estate are taking a longer view of having greater transparency and access to data for their platforms. And I think that every now and then something happens, let's call it a black swan event, which is the pandemic, which was the GFC. And, you can debate whether people saw the GFC, but I think the determination is that people didn't. And then this statement that capital for the last 14 years was more or less, there was no cost of capital, right? So interest rates were still flat, right? And so I think all of that, you've got this perfect storm now, and maybe a reminder that things need to be operated differently. And again, the access to information, the models by which platforms operate and how the investors invest has changed. I think the other big thing, though, in particular over the past 15 years, maybe a little bit longer, is that the capital markets increasingly invest on a global basis into real estate too, because there is more transparency. And then the second thing would be is the amount of Asian capital that's flowing globally is increasing too, and that's partially due to their ability in terms of a Korean pension fund, as an example, or an insurance company, to invest outside of Korea into real estate as an asset sector and increase that investment from like 1.5% up to 10%, 12%. And so all of that is changing. And so I think, again, leadership in terms of the understanding of what needs to be accomplished on a longer term view has definitely evolved. And also it's a more mature market in terms of just the capabilities that individuals have within the sector too, I would say.
Well, and actually that was my then extension of that, which is what are the capabilities you feel leaders now need? And you, I'll let you answer that, then I'm going to go back a step. So what are the capabilities we need in leadership?
I'd say the capabilities that we need in leadership is often to listen more. And that's probably saying the obvious. I think the second thing is to sometimes be patient, right? As well. So this combination, curiosity and the ability to actually learn to understand the differences geographically is certainly a big component. And I think is have the right incentive models for employees to stay on a longer term basis. I think that one of the things often in terms of the biggest challenge for most companies is high turnover of people, from the executive team down to core lieutenants to everyone that keeps the company operating. And so, if everyone is just on the short-term incentive, it's really hard to carry out this longer-term plan and vision, because the incentive structure changes every 2 or 3 years with that new executive that comes in and reevaluates things.
I actually think that's one of the hardest things to get right.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, one of the first things I had written about the topic of innovative strategy was the challenge of misaligned incentives.
Yeah.
And there's a misalignment on so many different levels. It's not as simple as looking at short-term bonus structures. It is the misaligned incentives of different teams with completely contradictory aims and objectives, and then you've got the stakeholders. You've then got shareholders at the very, very top end who are looking at executive pay and bonus structure, where there's a misalignment between what the shareholders want and what the board wants and what the executives are trying to achieve. And so there is so much to get done before even incentives are even looked at, which is, I think, Christ, in what was it, 2017, I think I defined PropTech with Professor Andrew Baum at the time.
Yeah.
And one of the key aspects that he and I were sort of going back and forth was the talk about it being a mentality shift, not a technological shift. And it keeps coming back to me now, which is everything we're doing here is a mentality shift, because if we're going to sort out incentives, the first thing we have to work out is the vision of those organizations has to be aligned in order for the incentive structures to then work. Because if you're an executive leader who's going to go on a 10 to 15 plus year journey, you have got to be safe and secure in the knowledge that you're going to go through some rough times. And I always use the football analogy of Man United. Once Ferguson was there was lots of very incremental innovation, moves and transfers and everything to make sure his tenure was successful. But there was no thought to the 10, 15 years after that in terms of what it would be and could be and should be. And they're still suffering now more than ever because it was just never there.
Yeah, incentives and culture, right? And maybe those words are interchangeable, but in that example of Man U is kind of an interesting one. And I'd say, Yardi, in terms of what keeps us together, and if you look at kind of the management structure, as well as kind of our directors that we have, is that our executive team has been with the organization for a long time, right? 20 plus years. And as we've grown, I think I was employee number like 780, and at that stage, we're doing about 120 million in global revenue. And so often we get labeled as, this company that's been around a lot and there's no innovation. And it's kind of ironic because what we view ourselves on is we're this company with a lot of history and experience in navigating these technology changes that have come over a period of time and market changes. And we're really this large organization that has, let's say, 40 different individual small startup prop techs within, because we're innovating in each of these different categories. And we make mistakes because innovation is hard, right? This idea that clients want you to innovate. Clients want you to have great product, great customer service, but innovation means you're going to break something every now and then. And so you kind of go through this happiness curve with your clients to say you stabilize everything, they're super happy, and then they say, I want you to do the latest and the greatest next thing because I need to be like others and I want to adopt what's new, right? And it doesn't always go well the first time, so your customer satisfaction goes down, and so you kind of fix it and you're back up on that 4 curve rather than that 5. And that just seems to be a good way of thinking about it, because you need to be realistic that innovating is hard. And so that's what kind of keeps me fascinating, that technology and the markets and the expectations keep on changing all the time, but there's just so much more innovation and so much more kind of digitization that we can do, but it takes time to figure out what's right and how to apply it and how to make sure that you hire great people and have the right teams in place and work with the right customers to make it happen.
It's a fascinating contradiction you highlight there around people wanting to be up the front and innovative, but not being happy when it doesn't work quite the way they want it to work. It's
but isn't that spot on, right? I mean, how many people, and so it's often like we also look back and we say 2015, 2016, the big topic of innovation was what? Blockchain.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and so we were still trying to figure out and still trying to figure out to this day in terms of blockchain, great technology, but what problem is it trying to solve?
Yeah.
And so we didn't invest anything into blockchain at that stage because we're still not sure what to do with it. And I remember, seminars and other events down at MIPIM or wherever it was, and organizations telling us that, if we don't adopt quickly, we're going to be out of the game because blockchain is just going to change the way that the entire world works. And you may say that AI right now is kind of similar. There's no doubt that AI will kind of, provide huge amounts of benefits, but there's all these other concerns about ethics, about kind of, a herd mentality around other things. And it has to be implemented and considered over time too. There's not just a quick fix to everything. And so we have large investments in AI and machine learning and have been doing so over a period of time. And we're starting to see some great results, but again, it'll take time to leverage across all the different areas that we want to be able to see and what our vision is for some of this new technology.
But this is the biggest challenge of innovation in my mind, which is you've got people who jump on a bandwagon are the early adopters, and then they, as much as they're early adopters, they're also early finishers, and they literally sort of run with everything that comes along. For me, I remember I had my first, I think, discussion with a gentleman called Ragnar, who used to run a big blockchain real estate organization in the States. And I remember my opening line to him, and this must have been like 2015, 16, I think it was, really, really early in the blockchain real estate side. And I said to him, I said, look, Ragnar, I said, I am going to tell you now, I will never understand blockchain on the technicality aspect. I will never hope to. I never want to. I never need to look into it. I don't want to. There'll be clever people, far cleverer than I, who will understand it. All I care about is its application and what it can do for me. And I had this same conversation, funnily enough, with Akina Ho, who's just taken on as a venture partner at Pi Labs, one of my interviews last week. And she and I were talking about a lot of this stuff. And we both came to the agreement that, all of your blockchains, the AIs, all of these sorts of technologies, and it is the classic hype curve. A lot of people get involved in the hype curve at the start when it's all overhyped, massively PR'd, right at the peak of expectations. And then as soon as it comes off that curve, people fall out and they leave the boat and they get off. I am still fascinated by all of those technologies we've just been talking about. And I stay with them because I see the application of it all, but I realize they're 10 years, 15 years away.
And so you could look to the .com era and say that mobile stores, so accessible via a mobile smartphone, which then wasn't a smartphone, but you had this protocol called WAP and other components. So all of this, so that was 2000, 2001, et cetera. And that was to be used on a Nokia or a Motorola, et cetera. So it was a very light version of a browser. But you didn't have the infrastructure yet for the overall speed of the internet and in terms of what they were trying to access in terms of how kind of the infrastructure was based. Or even if you look at e-commerce back then, you look at companies like Webvan and others, the ideas were central to what we have today and do. But it's taken 10 to 15 years, plus some other technology advancements like the smartphone, like the cloud, like the ubiquity of security to bring it to market. And so I think the same will happen. And that these ideas, that this kernel of an idea evolves over a period of time, but it might take 5, 10, 15, 20 years for it to be applicable on a larger sense and be capital worthy. If you look at all the investment right now in terms of the capital being deployed into AI startups, I think we need to also remember maybe a stat or even prop tech startups, et cetera, is that generally in Silicon Valley, like 2 out of 100 companies survive and have a positive outcome. That's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, right? Because again, it's all that innovation drives the future innovation too. But we need to kind of consider in terms of, as we think about whether it's acquisitions or we think about if we're the investor, the platform, the operator, in terms of their decision making, in terms of the thoroughness of whether that platform, that technology partner, that prop tech will be around for more than the next 12 to 18 months. And I think that's the hard thing that all of us need to figure out in terms of how do we innovate, how do we break things, how do we invest, how do we pay attention to things, how do we learn through it, and not kind of forget that our core business today is taking care of our customers and making sure that we have the right customer and the right unit at the right price and take care of the asset.
So let me just, as a final question then on that exact point, and let's use blockchain as the example tech that we're gonna work through. There is often the term used as the ambidextrous organization. Mm-hmm. And the ambidextrous leader is obviously a key component of that, where you've got the capacity of being able to look after the short-term business and continue to drive profits and do what your shareholders and stakeholders expect you to do, whilst at the same time being prepared for a blockchain type technology. How on earth does a leader in the real estate industry today do that with blockchain type technology, which has gone through already a massive ebb and flow within the technology life cycle? How would you do that?
Well, isn't that kind of like the $1 million question or the $1 billion question these days in terms of how to navigate that? And I think if there was an easy answer or thesis that you could apply, I'd take it slower, right? I'd take it slower, but also understand that no company is invincible and no customer base is invincible, as we've all been taught. And so one needs to stay close to what's happening in terms of close to your customers to understand what customers are needing, but also have a vision in terms of what they'll need in the future, because most customers don't know what they need in 5 years' time. They only know what they need now. And so you have to take them on that journey too. And I think to a degree, you need to be able to identify not just one strategy, but multiple strategies and observe those over a period of time. And again, listen to the market and speak to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, much of this is obvious. It's kind of like human nature that you should do this. But I think oftentimes when companies fail, they're so absorbed in their self-righteousness of what they've accomplished in the past, they forget about that. Because you've accomplished something in the past does not mean that you'll continue to be successful in the future, and people are still the basis of successful companies.
And that for me is the perfect end, because I'm in complete and utter agreement with exactly what you've just said. So I'm just going to end the